Leaders show up for leadership in all sorts of ways. They show up large, and they show up small. They show up loud, and they show up quiet. And sometimes they show up over time in terms of their impact. Well, I want to talk about a leader. His name is Peter. And Peter showed up at a manufacturing firm that built sunglasses, very, very wonderful, beautiful sunglasses with gold rims. But the thing about this manufacturing factory was it was not a very good place. It was a place where people would show up and it was unsafe. And the products they built were terrible. And the quality was really poor. And Peter came to that manufacturing firm and showed up with an idea. He wanted people to be owners, to take ownership for the things that they built and pride in that. And over a year and a half period of time, he worked at building that ownership. And one day, standing in the middle of a manufacturing plant floor, there was a young chemist, a woman from China, and there was a very muscular manufacturing worker standing next to her. And Peter was recognizing them for the work that they had done to save literally hundreds of thousands of dollars of gold that was going down the drain. And at the end of that recognition ceremony, Peter looked to the manufacturing employee. He looked up and he said, "You know, you have worked here for a number of years. And what I wonder is, did you see this problem before we ended up fixing it and bringing the chemist here to figure out the problem?" He said, "You know, I saw the problem for many years. But Peter, until you came, no one ever recognized what I did." And so you know what I did? I came to work. And before I walked in, I would take my brain. And on that hook, I would put my brain. And I would go off to work. And then I'd come back every single day and grab my brain. And I'd go back home. And I would use my brain for other things. Until you came here, Peter, I never felt a sense of ownership. And it is that kind of leadership, actually three types of leadership, that I would like to talk to you about today, that we have seen throughout history. Your history, my history, the world's history. The one type of leadership is a leadership that grows people, builds them up. Another type of leadership, which is very important, sustains people. Doesn't necessarily change them, it just keeps them doing what they do well. And then there's that leadership that comes along that diminishes people and makes them smaller so that they don't feel that sense of ownership. So I'd like to talk about those three types of leadership as we work through my presentation with you today. So let's move to another form of leadership, that is the leadership of a king. And this king happens to be the former king of Sweden. And it's this story about a ship that people will know from Sweden called the Vasa. And it's a wonderfully beautiful ship, about an hour from here by plane. And this ship was built between 1626 and 1628. And the king at that time was very involved in building this ship. And he had an architect who was tremendously experienced and had a lot of ideas about how the ship should be built. And the king would come in regularly and say, "Well, I want to add this cabin and this cornice and something to the top of the boat." And the architect would say, "Very good idea. Let's think about that." And he wouldn't do it because he knew it would not make the ship seaworthy. But during the course of that 2 years of building the ship, the architect died. And a younger architect came in. And the king kept coming back and saying, "I have this idea." And the young architect said, "Very good idea." And we built a cabin. And we put a cornice. And we built the ship up. And on August 10th, 1628, the Vasa set sail. Beautiful day in Stockholm. Blue skies, a little bit of breeze. It went out to the horizon. And that ship sunk on its maiden voyage. By the way, if you're ever having a bad day, think of the day that captain had of the Vasa. Puts it in perspective. There are many stories of ships that are being sent throughout the world that sink because there is a young architect or an inexperienced individual or just somebody who doesn't want to take on the king in the form of a CEO or in the form of a vice president or the form of a physician, and they don't challenge them, and ships sail. and ships sink. And we diminish people because in that instance, they haven't taken ownership. So let's talk about where leadership comes from that perhaps is not the birthright of a king or a queen. And so there are some people, maybe people here and people out there, that think that leaders are born. The doctor takes the baby, smack. Quite red, must be a leader. Smack, little pink, must be a follower. And on and on and on. And that's where leaders come from. Well, we got intrigued by that. And we went to talk to people who know about genetics, behavioral geneticists. And we asked them, how can we study if leadership is born or made? And they said, well, identical twins have nearly identical genetics. And fraternal twins are about 50%. So if we were to compare identical twins, and there are several studies that have followed these twins over their entire life, if identical twins were born to be leaders, then you would expect one identical twin that becomes a leader, then the other one would become a leader. Okay, that made sense. And so we looked at 3 different studies around the world that have followed twins throughout their life. What we found was if it was 0 to 100, the test, it wasn't 100% heritable. In fact, it was only 30%. 70% was made. So then why is it that we think leaders are born or natural when in fact most of it seems to be made? It's like the special effects in movies, where we think we see something, we can't explain it. And why is Keanu Reeves floating across the screen in The Matrix? Magic. No, it's not magic. There is some special effects. And what are these special effects? Are on the made side. So we started to see what are the kind of leaders who grow people, not diminish people. And we found leaders who others would say, these are some of the best leaders, like Peter, who grew them, made them feel like owners. And we asked them, what was their family like? What were their significant moments like in life? And then we asked their family members. And we kept asking people over and over in different places. And we found a couple of things that were very interesting. That leaders that grow people, that transform people, they had people in their life that challenged them extremely high expectations. And we would say, well, what happened when you failed? As I like to say today, no drama. No drama, just support. We just got help. And then what happened? Do it again. And then what happened? Do it again. And so they kept doing it over and over and over again until they got it right. And you see, the special effects in growing leaders who grow other people is having people that set high expectations and then help them to meet those expectations, as Peter had done in that manufacturing facility. And now we have an array of leaders up here who have different expectations. And all of them have come from very different backgrounds. And there's one of leader up there, Eleanor Roosevelt. Now here's someone who not only grew the people in my country, the United States, but people throughout the world, because she created the International Code of Human Rights. So she grew everybody. She built up everybody. And then there is Sister Mother Teresa, who is synonymous with caring. And she makes us all feel bigger as a consequence of her leadership and her ownership. And then Nelson Mandela, who had the 27-year training program for leadership in Robbins Island. And he comes out, and instead of being resentful, he comes out with compassion. He comes out with forgiveness. And he raises everybody up, the expectations for everybody. And then there are the others on there that diminish those people that they are supposed to serve. The Mussolinis, the Stalins, the Hitlers, and the fellow with all of the medals, Idi Amin. These are people that always diminish people. They don't want them to own. They want them to subordinate. They don't want them to question. They just want them to be compliant. And it's so those leaders that have created this unique disparity, yes, they have wonderful visions that become demonic, and they capture people's imaginations. They also capture people's souls in which they lose ownership. And the others, the Abraham Lincolns, they raise everybody up. They make everybody feel like an owner when some, at that time, were just slaves. So it is about expectations, and I love this story, and it's a story that goes back to 300 BCE. And it's a story about a wood carver. And this particular wood carver was given a commission from a leader, a very respected leader. And he so wanted to make this wooden statue perfect. And so day after day after day, he would go out into the woods and he would look for a tree, the perfect tree, in which he could carve that statue. And one day he found the tree. And he brought it back. And he carved that statue. And everybody was in wonder of the statue. It was amazing. And they asked him, "How did you create the statue?" And he said, "I went to the woods. I found the tree in which the statue was held, and I brought it to life." And the Greeks talked about this centuries later in what they called the Pygmalion effect with Galatea, and how Aphrodite helped one sculptor who so loved the statue bring that statue to life. And then in My Fair Lady, a movie that some of you might remember here and out there, or more recently, Pretty Woman with Julia Roberts. There was something special about those ladies and setting those expectations and bringing out in them something that they didn't see within themselves. That's all about the leadership that grows communities, grows organizations, grows societies, and by the way, grows children, grows families. Not unlike what we see in organizations, good and bad. Well, let's move to a different situation. A situation, actually, it's one of the most dangerous places you can go into. It's called a hospital. Hospitals are very dangerous. There are places where people get infections. In the United States, we estimate we kill 100,000 people every year. By the way, that's not my term, that's a physician's term. 100,000 people walk in, 100,000 people get killed. And oftentimes the reason why they get killed is because someone didn't take ownership. That's the wrong leg. Don't cut that leg. Did you wash your hands? You should wash your hands. Well, this is a story about a hospital where the CEO was passionate about creating a culture of safety. One day, he was taking these donors, people had given a lot of money to the hospital with him, to this beautiful new operating suite. And in that operating suite was a young woman, about 23. And she was sitting there working, and she turns around, and she looks, and she says, "Oh, good morning. Welcome. Can I ask you one question? Have you all washed your hands?" And the CEO said, "Yes, before we came in, we all washed our hands." And she said, "That's great, but you need to do that in front of me." And the CEO looked at her and he said, "Then we will." And some of the donors looked and said, "Do we have to?" And they did. And in that moment, and the CEO told this story all over the hospital, in that moment, that young technician said to that CEO, "I own this culture of safety. And when people come in here, they will be safe because I own that." And when we do safe operations in hospitals, people say, "I am this individual. I own this part of the operation. It's my responsibility to make it safe." And in that way, we grow. We don't diminish. Well, in another hospital, the medical director, who also was involved in promoting safety, walks into the elevator, and there's a guy there with some towels and some linen, and he says, "What are you doing today?" He said, "I'm improving patient flow, enhancing patient safety." I said, "How are you doing that?" He said, "If I don't change the bed sheets, infections rule the hospital. If I don't get the beds made, no one gets to the clinics. That's my job. I own it." And you see in those stories this sense of ownership. But let me tell you another story. It's not the ownership of an individual now. It's the ownership of an entire town. And it's a town in Nebraska, a middle part of the United States. And it's a town in 1941 called the North Platte. 1,200 people. The railroad would come through the town called the North Platte Canteen. And the soldiers would get off, either going to Europe or to the Pacific. And they would get off the train, and they have 10 minutes. Use the facilities, get a cup of coffee, get a magazine, maybe a sandwich. Well, the town heard that coming through that station was their National Guard, their young men, 18 years old, either going to Europe or to the Pacific, many of whom we know never came back. And no one knows who led this except the town. And the town decided it would meet the train, and the train would come in, and they would have the band, they would have the cheerleaders, they would have chicken salad sandwiches and angel food cake and magazines and papers, and they would dance and sing in 10 minutes, and then they would send them off. And on the day that the train arrived, the soldiers came off, and it was the Colorado National Guard, their arch football rival, which means something in the United States. We won't celebrate. Of course they celebrated. They were their soldiers. They celebrated. Now, that was not the end of the story. It felt so good that that town of 1,200 celebrated every train coming through for the next 4.5 years. 6 million soldiers. No other town in the United States took ownership for that 10 minutes of sending these soldiers, young men, and then women, off to war. 7 a.m. in the morning to 1 a.m. at night, trains would come through. It took people from states around to service the trains. It was amazing. And I told this story, and you're nodding and you're looking. And afterwards, this woman came up to me and said, I'm really upset with you. I said, well, I don't know why. This is a wonderful story. She said, I was one of the girls that went to the canteen, and I danced, and we sang, and we gave them angel food cake and chicken salad sandwiches, and then we ran out of chicken eggs, and we had to use turkey, but we were creative. And off they went. Off they went. She said, but it wasn't special. It was what we were supposed to do. My father woke me up at midnight. We got in the car. We drove till sunrise. We met our train. We went to breakfast. We went to church. We drove back. We did that for 4.5 years because we were supposed to do that. We owned that. And they grew from that. And they grew all of us. And it's a story that I love to tell, not about war, but about the human spirit, about what human beings can do when they come together without a leader, without someone telling them what to do. Which leads me to my last point. And where we're going in terms of the world today. And the world today, we don't have to rely upon big leaders and small leaders and loud leaders and leaders who are quiet. We see that we're relying more and more on crowds. So in Tiananmen Square, there was one brave young man who stood in front of a tank and was trying to stop a nation from doing something horribly wrong. Well, now there are thousands of people who come to those squares who are taking ownership. And it's not only in those situations that we would say are revolutions. You know, it's happening in medicine. Some of the great discoveries are happening through crowds. The crowds are coming together virtually around the world to address problems, intractable problems. Things that no one individual, no leader can say, well, let's do this. Here's the resources. Let's solve this. We have the capacity today to bring together people, to own something in a way that we don't have to be told what to do. We can figure out what we need to do. Now, I'm not suggesting that we don't need leaders who can grow people. We need a lot of parents who can do that. And we need a lot of teachers who can do that. We don't need all that many CEOs to do that, because there are people out there that know what to do, and if we give them the conditions to do that, you, the people out there, the entire crowd, we can all grow a better world together. Why don't we do it? Thank you.